A beautifully crafted opening can be the difference between someone deciding to play a game for 1 hour or 10. Get it right, and your audience will be hooked instantly. Get it wrong, and they may quickly decide to move on to something a bit more engaging. I've decided to make a list of my favourite video game introductions, selecting 10 examples I believe are a must-play, to highlight a few of the occasions where developers have knocked it out the park. As a side note, I've also covered a lot of my choices in more detail separately too, so do keep an eye out for the cards pointing you in the direction of their videos. And with that out of the way, let's get started. Prey is the only game on my list which is accompanied by a spoiler warning. If you've never played it but think you might like to give it a go, I'd recommend skipping this entry entirely. I was sort of excited for Prey prior to its release, but I wasn't sure what exactly to expect considering it shared the same name as its 2006 sibling, which I enjoyed, but looked to be completely unrelated. But none of that mattered once I got my hands on it. Taking control of Morgan Yu, you wake up in his futuristic apartment at the start of a seemingly normal day. You might notice a few things out of the ordinary, such as there being a book in the kitchen apparently published 1 year into the future, scuff marks on the floor in various places, and a maintenance worker who is trying to keep to a script. But you need to get to work, and so likely won't dwell on them for too long. Once there, you take part in some admittedly strange tests before it all goes horribly wrong, and you wake up back in the apartment. Nothing looks particularly different, but once you begin to explore, you'll realise quite a bit has changed. The maintenance worker lies dead in the hallway, and there are strange messages on your computer, and it won't be long before you go about planning your escape. Eventually, you'll hopefully try to smash the windows to access the balcony, at which point Prey's first big twist is revealed. You're on a space station named Talos 1, and the apartment itself is part of an experiment, with Morgan a lab rat of sorts. Suddenly, all the unusual things you spotted when you first woke up begin to make a lot more sense. The year is actually 2033, matching the date the book in the kitchen was published. The scuff marks are from the walls moving as the set changes, and the maintenance worker knew what was going on all along. It's an incredible setup for the rest of the game, which teaches you not to trust anything and to question everything. When I think about sequels that blew the first game in their series completely out of the water, one that always springs to mind is Dead Space 2. While the original is also a fantastic game in its own right, its follow-up is on another level, with basically everything being bigger, badder, and better. The Alien to Aliens comparison is an apt one here. Dead Space is a slower-paced, more brooding affair, although I will say Alien is more reserved than Dead Space, while the second includes an especially concentrated dose of action alongside its terror. This ramping up of intensity manifests from Dead Space 2's very beginning, which is one of the most memorable sequences in any horror game. There are some brief scenes prior to events turning a bit bonkers, but they are fleeting, and once everything gets going, it really gets going. Dead Space Ignition protagonist Franco frees hero Isaac Clarke from his cell and is promptly turned into a necromorph in front of you. I like to think of it as a metaphor for how in your face the rest of the game will be. A well-balanced mix of tutorialization and scares comes after, which keeps you learning and keeps you on your toes at the same time. The part I reckon illustrates this best is when you enter the area where a patient, still conscious, has been left alone mid-operation. It combines a fright in the form of the necromorph which appears, with a sensible in-world explanation for how Isaac acquires his plasma cutter, and a subtle tutorial as you're pushed towards using the nearby metal rods to take down several enemies. Add to this plenty of traditional shocks that will have you hiding behind the sofa, and a good amount of world building which never slows the action down, and what you get during Dead Space 2's opening is a relentless thrill ride that remains just as horrifying 11 years after the game's release. It might not look like much nowadays, but Half-Life's opening was a stunning start to the game. In 1998, most first-person shooters were very linear affairs which focused less on story and world building and more on simply blasting as many baddies as possible. That made the tram ride which begins Half-Life stand out straight away. You are not a grizzled space marine taking on hordes of enemies in nondescript corridors. You are scientist Gordon Freeman, and you're on your way to work. It's not the most traditional commute, granted, you are travelling to a research facility in the New Mexico desert, but nonetheless it felt 100 times more grounded than anything else on the market at the time. Once off the tram, you're able to explore your workplace for as long as you like. Colleagues wander around doing their own thing, and some will even stop to say hello. It was, for me at least, the first time time I ever felt like I was inhabiting a living, breathing world in an FPS, one which existed before I jumped into the story and would be there long after I left. These early stages also featured plenty of scripted events and set pieces, which again didn't really exist way back when, and the experience as a whole has a wonderful dynamism to it which was unparalleled in the late 90s. Rather than asking you to do little more than travel from A to B while doing a lot of shooting along the way, developer Valve does their very best to add enough to the world that you instead want to take things slower, so the game's atmosphere has time to seep into every fibre of your being, and they did a terrific job. Half-Life is one of the most important video games ever made, and much of what made it so special is fully on display during its first few minutes. If Half-Life was the PC shooter which set a new bar for what gamers could expect from the genre on the platform, then Halo Combat Evolved and its opening mission, The Pillar of Autumn, did similar for consoles. There had been some admirable past attempts to popularise the genre outside the PC space. GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64 is the example I always point to, but in terms of both quality and depth, consoles generally lagged a long way behind their more powerful counterpart, which was especially so following the release of Half-Life, as developers moved away from linear romps with Space Marines and towards more thoughtfully constructed experiences. It was sort of poetic then that the game which proved the gap was rapidly closing in many ways felt like a combination of PC shooters past and present. On the one hand, Master Chief was a character more in the mould of protagonists of old, a hardened super soldier capable of taking down an extraordinary number of enemies. On the other, the game built around him was as well considered as those found on PC, with the production values to match. From Halo's outset, it was clear the game was something quite unlike any other FPS on console. It fostered a sense of intrigue from the off with the reveal of the mysterious Installation 04, and a strong group of supporting characters were introduced. Set pieces and scripted events were used in abundance to build atmosphere early on, with chaos erupting around you as alien adversary the Covenant attacked the ship. Tying it all together were controls and design which made gameplay feel immediately intuitive. For me, it evoked the same emotions I felt when playing Half-Life for the first time. Traversing the hallways of the Pillar of Autumn as allies fell to plasma fire and explosions destroyed parts of the ship was the watershed moment for console shooters, and one I won't forget for a very long time. Resident Evil 4 was a title which deviated hugely from the series' template, one which traditionally utilised fixed camera angles, pre-rendered backgrounds, and slow, lumbering zombies. Rather than sticking to the status quo, Capcom instead decided to modernise the series, using a third-person, over-the-shoulder perspective, 3D environments, and far more threatening enemies. Nowhere in Resident Evil 4 do these changes complement each other more perfectly than during its first large-scale encounter taking place in a very unsettling Spanish village. After a few brief battles with one or two ganados, you arrive there and witness the body of one of the police officers you travelled with being burned. Then you're spotted, and all hell breaks loose as a mob of angry villagers quickly converge on your location. Any doubts about whether 4 was any good would have dissipated around this point, as the action which ensues is absolutely fantastic. You're never given the opportunity to stand still for more than a few seconds, as what seems like an endless wave of enemies chases you, and you have to use every ounce of cunning to avoid becoming mincemeat. Fortunately, there were also plenty of new gameplay options you could use to your advantage, for example, targeting specific parts of the body to slow down your pursuers, or interacting with the environment by blocking doorways, jumping off roofs, or similar. It was truly revolutionary and acted as the blueprint for a whole new style of third-person action game, one a staggering number of titles would make use of. Of course, the rest of 4 was incredibly entertaining too, but it's during its first set piece that the success of the series' transition was most evident and most impactful. The next opening is so brilliant because it serves as a succinct, very violent manifesto for the entire game it precedes. Doom doesn't waste time weaving an overly complex narrative or explaining how to play it in exhaustive detail. There's a very short voiceover to set the scene, and you're then immediately thrown into the action. Indeed, within the first minute or so, the Doomslayer has already torn himself from his shackles and crushed the head of a possessed scientist, before you take control and continue to annihilate the nightmarish creatures which surround him. Where Doom 3, the previous attempt to update the series, on balance strayed too far from the franchise's roots, roots, Doom 2016 leans into them with unapologetic gusto. The game does have a story, one which becomes more prominent later on, but during these early stages, developer id Software focuses only on the headline, which reads, "You are the Doomslayer. The Doomslayer is a badass. Don't worry too much about the story. Don't think about things too hard. Go forth and rip and tear." This is communicated superbly through the actions of the Doomslayer himself, who displays a surprising amount of personality considering Doom's context and the fact he never speaks. Whether he's destroying a monitor to avoid having to listen to any exposition, tearing a shotgun from a corpse's hands, or punching a screen in a lift to usher in the title card and a lovely bit of rock music, everything is so incredibly expressive and perfectly encapsulates what the game is all about. Given Doom's setup, you perhaps won't be surprised at how the rest of the game unfolds, at least at a high level, and considering how its awesome introduction is handled, that's no bad thing at all. It's difficult to put into words just how excited I was for Metal Gear Solid 2. I was a very fortunate young man who had managed to secure a PlayStation 2 at launch, and while I had already enjoyed plenty of games on the system and was looking forward to plenty more, Solid Snake's first next-gen outing was the one game I was really waiting for. I heard the opening chapter would come packaged with Zone of the Enders, and so I rushed out to get my hands on it the day Konami's mech-based shooter released, and it completely lived up to, and often exceeded, expectations. The tanker section which opens Metal Gear Solid 2 was so far ahead of most other games available at the time that I could scarcely believe what I was playing. Exploring the outside of the ship as the rain lashed down was one of the most graphically impressive things I'd ever seen, and its interior was no different, with a level of interactivity on display which was truly mind-blowing. Most seemingly innocuous objects in the environment could be interacted with many giving you a tactical advantage. Footprints and even a cough could give you away, and guards maintained consistency within the areas they patrolled. They'd even hunt you down if alerted to your presence. Alongside its gameplay innovations, it also weaved a tale, a short story of sorts, which made the tanker sequence feel like both its own thing and setup for the rest of the game. It almost functions as its own mini Metal Gear Solid, with familiar characters returning and a new Metal Gear to thwart, and it ends on a cliffhanger which I'd imagine left most on the edge of their seats. If you don't fancy playing through it in its entirety, do try to at least go back and play Metal Gear Solid 2's introduction. It won't take you longer than an hour or two to get through, and I guarantee you won't be disappointed. My word, is Mass Effect 2's opening so very, very good. A quick scene involving a shady new character and a little bit of text on screen is followed by what is without doubt one of the most impactful introductions in all of gaming. It's often hard to understand how powerful the primary antagonist in a video game is without witnessing it yourself firsthand, and boy oh boy do you get to witness it firsthand at the start of Mass Effect 2. Its first few scenes go so far towards making the Collectors feel like an insurmountable threat, with their lasers quickly cutting through the Normandy like a hot knife through butter. Not only is the Collector's superiority clearly demonstrated, but developer BioWare even opts to hand over control to you so you can better gaze upon the devastation yourself. The transition during that gameplay segment from explosions and cries of terror to the vacuum of space and back again is a particularly engaging change of pace, and it's a moment that stuck long in my memory well after the opening had finished. And to top it all off, how many games conclude their intro with the death of the series' main character? The shot depicting Shepard's death is breathtaking too, juxtaposing the end of his life against the beginning of a new day. Setting up most of the major plot threads, who is the elusive man, why did the Collectors attack the Normandy and the like, over the course of one relatively short sequence, I think it's fair to say that Mass Effect 2 starts with a pretty loud bang. I still struggle to watch the final scenes of The Last of Us's opening without bursting into tears, and I think that's testament to how excellent a job Naughty Dog did crafting an extremely compelling introduction. Beginning with a few moments shared between player character Joel and his daughter Sarah, you're then left alone to walk around their home playing as Sarah. The more you explore, the quicker it becomes clear that something very bad is happening, with newspaper headlines speaking of a mysterious infection and explosions lighting up the town nearby. Your confusion about what exactly is happening is shared by Sarah, who essentially mirrors your own emotions, and given what happens later on, establishing this connection to her was a very important thing for Naughty Dog to get right. Joel soon returns, dispatching his infected neighbour moments later, and from that point onwards, events begin to rapidly increase in intensity. You see bystanders being attacked by the infected, buildings on fire, and mayhem in every direction you look, and you even get a sneak peek at the ruthless streak Joel apparently possessed even before events of the rest of the game through the way he deals with some hitchhikers. And then you're thrown into the midst of things yourself following a car crash. Naughty Dog does a brilliant job of bringing order to the chaos which follows through a series of smart design choices, which help you navigate the town's streets smoothly and without confusion, even with there being so much going on around you. Finally, you eventually reach the end of the road, where perhaps the most heartbreaking cinematic I've ever seen in a video game occurs. The Last of Us starts as it means to go on, by telling a story which hits home harder than almost any other in the medium, and the effect it had on me, and I'm sure many others, cannot be understated. BioShock's opening is one of my favourite introductions in any video game, full stop. I think developer Irrational Games knew how stupendous it was too, as they chose to put out the section in demo form ahead of the game's release, and that teaser did a great deal towards building hype for a game I don't think was on as many people's radars as it perhaps should have been. Not only does it introduce just the right amount of intrigue to get you really excited for what's to come, but at the same time it does a great job of acclimatizing you to the game's basic mechanics in ways which make sense in world. I'm not sure I've ever been as immersed in a setting as I was Rapture when I first played BioShock. Its graphics were jaw-dropping from a technical perspective, and the Art Deco stylings which accompanied them gave the crumbling city a cohesive look and feel which made it seem almost otherworldly, but also entirely plausible. The story of Jack and his journey through Rapture is no less engaging either, and acclimatizing to the city during the game's early stages is an experience I'll never forget. You meet splicers, you run across a big daddy and a little sister, you stick a mysterious needle into your arm, which apparently was a sensible idea for some reason, and gain the ability to shoot electricity from your hand. Every single time you begin to think BioShock has no more surprises left, it throws another curveball at you, and this is just during its first 20 to 30 minutes. By the time I reached what I'd describe as the end of the beginning, as you're trapped by Rapture's founder Andrew Ryan and set upon by a horde of angry splicers, I knew BioShock was something very special. Its opening remains to this day one of the most magical gaming experiences I've ever had, and I cannot recommend it and the rest of the game enough. Both are truly remarkable. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls, and fans of list-based content. If you enjoyed the video, do consider liking, subscribing, and letting me know what your favourites are, and touch wood, I'll see you again soon.